Okay, well, we're gonna go ahead and get started tonight. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight for Combating Climate Change on the Farm. My name is Alice and I am with the Oregon State University Extension Service Master Naturalist program out of the Washington County Extension Office. And tonight's webinar is part of a 6-part series that we're co-hosting with the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District. And tonight's speaker is Tatiana Taylor, and we also have Andrew with us from Tualatin Soil Water Conservation District as well. During tonight's webinar, you will have the opportunity to ask questions. There'll be a pause in the middle of the presentation and there'll be time at the end. So go ahead and use that Q&A feature down below to ask any questions. And before we get started, I'm going to pass it off to Andrew and Tatiana.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us all this evening. As Alice mentioned, this is part of a 6-part webinar series that we're going to be holding throughout this the summer. And tonight's presentation is about how we can help combat the effects of climate change on our local farms and farms throughout the area. We'll be having a Q&A at the very end, and then we also have a short intermission for any questions that you might have. So if anything pops up as you're seeing any slides, please feel free just to go ahead and put those into that Q&A box, and we will address them when we hit either the middle or at the end of the presentation. And with that, I will hand it over to Tatiana.
Hi, everyone. Well, thank you so much, Andrew, for the introduction. Thanks for being here, everyone. My name is Tatiana Taylor, as said previously, and I work for the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District. So I am the rural conservation technician, and so I provide conservation plans for a variety of farmers and ranchers here in Washington County. And yeah, I'll just dive right in. I'll give you a little bit of a preview of what I'd kind of like to talk about today. First off, I'll just give you a little snippet of kind of what the district does and what the Soil and Water Conservation District is all about. And then I'd like to talk about the ways that climate change is going to affect the natural world and what that's going to look like for farmers, and especially how that's going to apply to those of us in the Willamette Valley. Later on, I'd like to talk about some different practices or ways to minimize the impacts of climate change on the farm. So kind of get into the nitty-gritty and some specific actions you can take to kind of help mitigate climate change. And finally, I have a couple of resources that I'll pull up on my screen that we'll take a look at, that they're online, that can just be of use for farmers and ranchers, and just anyone in particular interested in seeing what's going on in terms of climate change. And they provide a lot of really good information. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started with combating climate change on the farm. So to start, I'll just kind of give you a quick overview of what the district, what we're all about here at the district. I really like these four blue blurbs kind of in the middle of the presentation or the PowerPoint. I think they do a really good job of kind of explaining what the district is about. So the first one says we're non-regulatory, and I think that's very key to the district. So we are non-regulatory. All of our conservation is based on voluntary action. So we don't have to regulate any rules, anything like that. We do serve everyone. So we have a variety of programs through the district. Like I said before, I'm with the Rural Conservation Program. And so we work with a lot of farmers and ranchers, but we've also got, a conservation education program, which is what Andrew's a part of, and, putting things on like this. Forestry, we have urban, invasive species, and streams. And so hopefully we have a program for everyone. We are connectors. So, we do work with a lot of different entities outside of the district. And so, if we don't know the answer necessarily, then maybe we can help you get to the answer. And we're local, so we serve the residents of Washington County is kind of where we're at here. And we've been around since 1955, and we're one of the 45 SWCDs in Oregon. So although if you don't live in Washington County, you should have a soil and water conservation district in your county to kind of help with technical and financial assistance. And we're in Washington County. Some of the guiding principles of the SWCDs, or soil and water conservation districts, we believe that conservation should be led by local citizens. So like I said before, all of our projects, they're all voluntary, based on voluntary conservation. We believe that the final responsibility for conservation lies with landowners, and that SWCDs are responsive to both landowners and operators and the community as a whole. I really like this image. It kind of answers the question of why we're called the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District and not the Washington County SWCD. And it's because, if you can see actually my mouse here on the screen, the black dashed line shows the border of Washington County. And you can see from this map that actually the Tualatin River watershed they kind of align fairly well, which is typically not the case. But because the Washington County border and the Tualatin River watershed border are so similar, we're the Tualatin River, or the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District. We have a variety of land uses within the watershed. So about 50% of the landmass is in forestry land. About 35 is in agricultural lands, and about 15% of the landmass is in urban. We have a variety of natural resources and the conservation issues that often present themselves with those natural resources. But all these different areas have an impact on the watershed as a whole. And I think this illustration does a really good job of showing, that we are all connected in the watershed, and that everything affects something else in the watershed. The Tualatin River watershed is bordered by the Coast Range in the west, the Tualatin Mountains in the north and east, and the Chehalem Mountains to the south. And the Tualatin River is actually the only river in the watershed, but it drains over 900 miles of tributary streams. Washington County receives about 40 inches of precipitation annually, which definitely results in a lot of impact on our waterways and just all that, those kind of issues that may come up with a large amount of precipitation, such as compaction and erosion and such. The Tualatin River then meets the Willamette River, and then it flows into the Columbia, and then it goes out to the Pacific Ocean. So diving on into climate change on the farm. This fact is a little bit scary, but 2019, over 10 million acres of crops went unplanted because of extreme weather conditions in North America. And so extreme weather is the result of climate change. It's kind of how climate change is manifesting. And so we kind of want to look at what does extreme weather look like, especially here locally, and how is it going to affect our farmers? The first one, the first kind of extreme weather I want to talk about is just a changing precipitation pattern. So we're getting more intense periods of rainfall, and so storms are going to be more severe. You're going to have more rainfall in shorter periods of time. And with that comes a lot of erosion concerns, just because, as you have a lot of rainfall all at the same time, the soil doesn't have the time to then let the water percolate, get, absorbed down into the groundwater. And so that can cause some serious issues in terms of erosion and compaction as well. We're going to have longer periods of drought. So with those intense periods of rainfall, then we get longer periods of drought. And then the timing of the seasonal rainfall in the seasons themselves are actually changing a little bit. So the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute released their 4th annual climate assessment last January, so January 2019. And they released their findings, and they actually found some benefit for farmers in Oregon, because they found that we're actually seeing a longer growing season, and it could actually lengthen in the Willamette Valley by about 2 months, just because spring is starting, a lot earlier in the year, and fall is lasting longer throughout the year. And so that's kind of an interesting change for climate change. But There's also coastal storms and flooding are another issue that will arise that maybe won't be so pertinent to us in the Willamette Valley, but definitely for the folks, you know, on the western part of the state. Increased wildfire risk is another one that's due to changing precipitation patterns, although that maybe doesn't correlate quite as much as some folks might realize. It's due to how the precipitation is occurring. So we're no longer getting as much snowpack in the mountains, and we're getting more rainfall. So although we might be getting similar amounts of precipitation, what's actually happening is it's all coming as rainfall, and our snowpack is one, less, and then it's two, melting earlier just because it is getting hotter. And so with that, there's less water available as snowpack, and so stream flows are decreasing. More rain actually means more vegetation. And so with the addition of hotter summers, we can actually have more wildfire risk, because although that seems kind of counterintuitive in that, you know, you have a very wet spring and you're like, well, great, we'll go into summer and, you know, have a low wildfire risk. Because the drought seasons are getting longer, you actually are essentially adding fuel to the fire, because the rainwater is, you know, a really wet spring means there's a lot more vegetation. So there's a lot more fuel for potential wildfire risk. Changing temperature patterns, this is kind of the obvious one. You know, we used to refer to climate change as global warming. So there's obviously a rising average temperature. In that climate assessment I talked about earlier, they found that the Pacific Northwest has warmed about 2 degrees Fahrenheit since 1900. And they predict that by the end of the century, that Oregon is gonna get about 4 to 9 degrees hotter. We're also getting just more intense periods of heat during the summer. I think we can maybe attest to that right now. I definitely have my air conditioner running, but we're getting drier and hotter summers, and more temperatures with spiking temperatures, more days with spiking temperatures, excuse me. And with the exception of the mountains and the coast, that report found that Oregon will see an increase of 30 days per year with temperatures above 86 degrees. So even though everything's getting hotter, it's getting more severely hotter for shorter periods of time. Changing agricultural practices. So the crop viability will shift, and where those crops are most suitable. One of the resources I want to talk about a little bit later in the presentation is called the Climate Toolbox, and it's created by the University of Idaho, and they actually have a tool to determine the suitability of certain crops and where they're at. So that could be a great resource to farmers. With this kind of changing environment, we get new pests and weeds. And in that same study, they found that weeds tend to thrive with higher carbon dioxide levels, which is definitely not a good thing. But they've also found that, you know, as things shift, pests might be more suitable for the area, that, you know, pests that might have been frozen out earlier are maybe no longer getting those cold temperatures to get killed off or whatnot. So we're seeing an invasion of different pests and weeds. Finally, farming families are going to be some of the first to feel the effects of climate change, just due to hotter summers and less water resources available. You know, they're living off of the land, and they're so interconnected with that they'll definitely be the ones to feel those kind of those issues. And actually, with that, I kind of hurried through it, but it's a little bit of an intermission. If anyone has any questions, I'll definitely try to slow down and explain myself a little bit in the future. Doesn't look like there's any questions. Alrighty, moving on, I think. Unless Andrew had something to say. Cool. Alrighty, so I'll dive into how to prepare for climate change. I don't know, there we go. If you can do such a thing. But there's kind of 4 big concepts in terms of what you can kind of do to your property, to your land, that can kind of help mitigate those effects and help lessen the blow of climate change. And the first one is build healthy soil. That's really critical. Just as you get healthier soil, you can hold more moisture, it can hold more nutrients, and just can be more effective. And developing water conservation strategies, as I kind of talked about earlier, water is going to be one of the biggest limited resources. And so trying to find ways to kind of stretch that water usage is going to be really critical. Another kind of thing to do is planting more habitat. And I don't think that that's maybe something that you know, is super intuitive. But planting more habitat can definitely help kind of mitigate climate change, and using the available resources. So at the end, again, I'll go over to those websites and kind of take a look and show you guys what those look like. So for building healthy soils, one of the most critical kind of things I've seen a lot of people suggest is using regenerative farming practices. And those are farming practices that seek to rehabilitate and enhance the entire ecosystem of the farm by placing a heavy premium on soil health, with attention also paid to water management, fertilizer use, and more. And so that's just using a variety of different practices to kind of build up your soil. Because like I said earlier, you know, healthy soil captures more carbon and it holds more water. So as you add organic matter, you actually increase the space between the molecules in your soil. And so you're able to hold more water. And so you won't have to irrigate as much, you know, you just have a higher water holding capacity. Cover crops and rotational cropping systems are a great way to help build soil health. Crop rotation increases the variety of plants that are grown, and therefore it increases the diversity of the microbes in the soil. So as you have different types of plants, you're developing different microbes in your soil, and the more microbes, the healthier your soil is going to be. Crop rotation can also help with pest management. They've done studies that show that crop rotation can help with a reduction in nematodes and in weeds and diseases. So just as you rotate your crops through, those pests aren't as comfortable, and you're going to be able to kind of not let them settle in as much if you're kind of keeping them on their toes, essentially. I did find one example. It's from the Midwest, so it's maybe not as pertinent to us here in the Willamette Valley, but the northern leaf blight has increased the last several years, but they found that by putting in a rotation of corn and soybeans, they can drastically reduce that blight. Cover crops and crop rotations can actually provide habitat to certain pollinators. So just by providing, you know, I'm sure as you guys are well aware, different types of cover crops can provide a lot of, you know, habitat for pollinators. And cover crops can also add nutrients back into the soil. So if you're doing some sort of legume, adding that nitrogen back into the soil can be very critical, especially here in the Willamette Valley where nitrogen leaching can be such an issue. And just, it can also, if you're leaving cover crops on, that they can be incorporated back into the soil as organic matter, preventing erosion, stuff like that. No-till or reduced till strategies is definitely a big one in terms of building soil health. So by allowing your soil, you know, but by not tilling your soil, you can allow that plant matter on the soil surface to decompose and add nutrients back into the soil as organic matter. It also greatly reduces erosion. So by keeping that soil covered, you're just preventing any sort of, you know, wind erosion or water erosion, just by keeping it covered. And then also by maintaining a soil, the root mass down below can definitely keep the soil where it's at and can help prevent compaction and other things like that. Tilling also releases carbon into the atmosphere. So as little as we can do of that is definitely beneficial. Pasture management, and this is a practice I actually do. I work with a lot of landowners with at the district here with pasture management. Again, it's not one that maybe makes the most sense, but you can kind of relate back to those soil health principles with your pasture management. And so good pasture management typically includes some sort of rotational grazing, and that's when you break a pasture up into different units and then move the livestock through the units. And this kind of allows you to manage when and what the livestock are eating. With this kind of rotational grazing, you can decrease bare soil because you're not allowing them to overgraze and you're moving them through the units before any sort of soil damage is occurring. Livestock tend to regraze plants that they've already grazed once because that new growth is super palatable. And so if you're able to move them through a rotation, you prevent them from rebrowsing your palatable species. And with that, it kind of, it can help reduce your pest species. And so, you know, with pest species, I'm mostly talking about maybe less desirable pasture plants, but if you're able to kind of mob graze and get your livestock all together and prevent them from just picking and choosing at what's most palatable, you can prevent weed species from taking over. I see that a lot with fescue. It's not as palatable, and so the livestock tend to like avoid it because it's a little bit rougher and it's not as sweet. And so then you end up with a pasture full of fescue because it's the only thing that's regenerating. And although that might not be technically a weed species, eventually you end up with a pasture that they won't eat anything off of. So rotating them through can greatly reduce that. Increasing organic material. Obviously manure is a great addition to pastures, although it's not technically applying more nutrients because they are grazing off of that pasture itself. They are providing it for just for the plants as much more of an available source of organic matter and source of nitrogen and phosphorus and stuff like that. Just by, you know, not allowing your animals to regraze and overgraze, you can also allow those plants to kind of regrow a little bit more, and you're adding more organic matter back to your pasture. Alley cropping. Again, it relates back to all of those kind of same soil health principles. It keeps the soil covered, and again, that reduces erosion, that reduces compaction, but it also kind of reduces competition from the weeds. So a lot of our weed species tend to move in if you have disturbed your bare soil. So if you're able to keep your bare ground covered, you're less likely to have that kind of battle with the weeds. Water conservation, this is a great one for kind of combating effects of climate change. Implementing efficient irrigation systems can save you a ton of water. So I pulled these numbers actually off of the Energy Trust of Oregon, but they show that big gun irrigation systems are estimated at about 60% efficiency, whereas a pivot or linear is about at 85% efficiency, and then drip systems are at 95% water efficiency. And so you can really save and stretch a ton of the water by just implementing more efficient irrigation systems. You can also create bioswales, which doesn't necessarily you know, provide water or maybe stretch the water, but you know, for a longer period of time. But what it does do is can help mitigate areas that are really wet. So if you have a place that gets super muddy every year, you can go ahead and create a bioswale, and you can capture that rainwater and allow it to percolate back through the soil rather than just running off and, you know, carrying sediment or whatever into the, you know, if you have a neighboring creek or neighboring surface water. But typically you go ahead and like scoop out a bunch of dirt and then put rocks and gravel and a lot of like water loving native plants, and that'll kind of allow, you know, the water to kind of drain and take its time in getting back into the groundwater. In Oregon, you can also capture rain runoff. So Oregon's a little bit, it's nice because of the the water law does allow you to capture water off of your roof. The water states, or the law states, that once the water hits the ground, it's a water of the state. So you can't capture water and put it in a pond and then irrigate out of it. But you are able to put it in, I know people do rain barrels or cisterns, which are shown in the presentation. And you can hold water, you can capture it, during the winter when we have plenty of water, and then hold it for the summer for livestock water or for irrigation or for a variety of other uses. But it just makes sense to kind of capture it, when we have an overabundance, and then save it for, in the summer when we're not getting as much rainfall. Increasing habitat. So there's a huge benefit to planting native trees and shrubs. They need, when you use natives, they typically need a lot less inputs just because they're better adapted to the area. So they're gonna need less irrigation. They're not gonna really need any water necessarily. They're not gonna need a lot of fertilizer. They're not gonna need all of that stuff that more traditionally landscaped plants might need. And that in itself can help just by using fewer inputs. You can also use hedgerows for a variety of reasons, actually. You can use them to increase pollinator habitat. And as I'm sure you guys are aware, pollinators are really struggling, and so any additional habitat is definitely beneficial for them. But when you do use a hedgerow for pollinator habitat, you'd like to use a variety of shrubs, typically early blooming, mid blooming, and late blooming. So you can kind of extend the season for your pollinators and providing a lot of food available for them. Hedgerows can also be used for privacy. I know that some of my more rural residents are definitely feeling the pressure of like an increasing urban population. And so one of the things that they're putting hedgerows in is for privacy and to kind of protect livestock and protect crops from any sort of disturbance. But it can also, hedgerows are great. They can be used to reduce chemical drift or odor. They can reduce dust or noise and provide kind of a barrier for that. They can be used as erosion control. And obviously they can be used as carbon storage. So any new trees or shrubs are always beneficial, and that not only are they providing oxygen for us, they also help to sequester carbon and pull that CO2 out of the atmosphere. Alrighty, so finally I want to just talk about a couple different available resources that we have out there. The first one is the USDA Climate Hub. This is a great one. It has a ton of information on it, and it is for the Northwest, so it's not based out of the Midwest or anything. Stuff is fairly localized for us. I did notice today that they actually have a virtual Northwest drought workshop. So unfortunately you missed that one, guys, but they've got a ton of great information. Some of it is slightly more high level. There is a lot of research papers and stuff, but they do have, they had some, so you can go to Oregon, but they had some fine water conservation tips. They have current drought maps, just a ton of just great high level information if you're ever curious on what's going on there. The second one is maybe a little more user-friendly, I would say. This is the Climate Toolbox, and this is the one I kind of referred to previously in the presentation. And they have a ton of different tools, and they're all very interactive and very specific. And so, yeah, we've got it in the presentation, and we can definitely make sure to send these links out as well if people are interested in playing around with them. The one I wanted to show you guys was the future crop suitability. I think this is just the coolest thing. When you first pop in, they'll let you take a tour, and so they'll probably explain it better than I am. But it shows the future crop suitability of where you're at. So it's using my location, but you guys can change that and be more specific to what you're doing. And I have it set on suitability. These are the crops they have on this. They've got almonds, apples, blueberries, cherries, and then 2 different types of grapes. and it just shows how suitable this climate is for those crops. You can change time periods. I usually like to go ahead and switch it because we're already in 2020. So I'd like to see what's maybe in the future. But this stuff over here is really, it's the explanation of how this crop is going to do where you're at. And they've got all these different like types of things they analyze. And essentially it shows you how many years out of 10 this crop would be suitable for. It took me a little bit to kind of wrap my head around that measurement, but you know, almonds is showing for where I'm living right now that 10 out of 10 years they would survive cold hardiness. So they're fairly good in terms of cold hardiness. Heat accumulation, maybe not so much. But yeah, I just thought that was an interesting thing just to help people if they're interested in, you know, starting something new or planting something different. That's a great kind of place to go. And finally, it's the SWCD. I won't take you to our website, but we are here and available. With that, I will go look at the question and answers. All righty. What is the typical time for planting cover crops? Does this timing line up when the pollinators are out? Good question. Oh, that's a great one. Yes. Cover crops, typically you'd like to see them, they can kind of be implemented whenever, depending on what your kind of cropping system looks like. I think typically it makes the most sense to have them potentially over winter. That's really when you are going to get your biggest erosion issue. However, we just did a project where we had a gal implement some oats and clover, and I think she even threw some alfalfa out there just for what she was doing, and she planted it early this spring, and so it was actually a spring cover crop, and it's done really well to kind of hold that soil in place. But typically I think you'd like to maybe do like a fall or late summer planting, get them kind of growing, and then that way they can provide a lot of stability through the winter, because that's when we get all our rains. That's when you're going to have, you know, the most erosion issues and compaction issues, and that's when you really want cover. So it doesn't necessarily line up when pollinators are out, but it can, depending on what you're planting. And if you're doing a spring planting, then that's perfect. Oh, a hedgerow. I should have defined that. I apologize. Essentially, it can vary tremendously, but what we've been doing a lot of is, it's a big kind of, if you can envision like old England, they used to do these really big, just true rows of really tall and thick shrubby stuff. And they used to use it to like delineate differences between fields. But now we're able to kind of use more native stuff. And so it doesn't necessarily look as much of a wall of like plant material as it might used to have been, but we can use different shrubs and stuff, typically planting them in a line kind of. And a lot of times it's on the outside of a field. And now we can use them for just a huge variety of different reasons. But hopefully that makes sense. I probably should have put a picture in there. Links on a follow-up email, yes, possible.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so I'll jump in there for you, Tatiana. So I forgot to mention at the top, we'll also be sending out a follow-up email to everyone, most likely by the end of the week, that will have a recording of this presentation that we'll post on the SWCD's YouTube channel. We'll also include a couple of the links that Tatiana has shown us and gave us a little sneak preview into today. And then there'll be a link to a evaluation survey for this webinar. You'll also have that survey will pop up right after you close out of this webinar. So if you wouldn't mind taking a few minutes to complete that for us, it's a huge help in us developing these webinars further. Sorry for interrupting there.
No, that was great. That was perfect. Ooh, yes, absolutely. And the question was, can you include some of the Xerces planting lists for hedgerows. Yeah, there's a great one that Xerces Society did put out, which is awesome. And then we've actually put together, maybe I'll have Andrew also put our specification on there. So what we've kind of been doing, and it's got a great list of, probably shouldn't talk it up that much because I did make it, but it's got a good list of a variety of different plants and then their blooming seasons. And then it's got, I want to say water levels, but also, or water requirements, but also toxicity to livestock. Because I've been doing some that are around, you know, borders of livestock facilities. And so obviously that's a concern. But yeah, I can definitely include both of those things. I think those would be super helpful.
Absolutely.
What can homeowners in suburban areas do to help small farms and farmlands adapt to climate change? Oh, that's a wonderful question. That's a great question. I'm thinking, I mean, I'm always a proponent, this isn't necessarily to help farmers, but just to help yourself is just to plant as much native. I'm always a proponent of planting native vegetation. I don't own my house yet, but one day when I get a yard, I'm very excited to put a lot of different just natives out there just because they do provide just a ton of wildlife and they're so adapted to where we're at. We're really lucky in the Willamette Valley and Portland especially in that we are really pretty close to a lot of our agricultural lands. And that doesn't happen a lot. So I feel really fortunate in that I'm able to a lot of the smaller farms are able to do like a CSA, which is a community supported agriculture. And so it's when you get like a box of vegetables like every week or every other week. And I found that's a great way to support local farmers. And I find that a lot of farmers that are really kind of in tune with the general population are also maybe already thinking about this and really trying to kind of do their best on that. But definitely just helping, you know, keep small farms in business is, I think, very critical. Hopefully another thing
I'll even throw out there too is just going to your local farmers markets as well.
Yes.
You know, there are the direct CSA boxes, but even just visiting your local farmers markets and supporting farms, whether that's for them being able to adapt to climate change or just supporting them in general, are all things that are huge benefits in undertaking some of these things.
I realized I should probably throw up my contact information as well in case anyone, and I think this will be included later as well, but I'll throw it up here just in case. Yeah, I feel like we're very fortunate here, you know, here in the Portland metro area just to be so close. I mean, I feel like I can drive 20 minutes and I'm like, ooh, I'm in farmland. Like it's amazing. Certain pests we are projecting to see increase with climate change. Yes, I might not have the most up-to-date information. Actually, Andrew included a beautiful photo of the Western pine beetle here at one of the, I'm trying to find it, oh, right here. So this is a ponderosa pine and this is a pine beetle going ahead and digging in. And that's one that I know that's been really common because of climate change, because they're not being frozen out as often as they used to be. So because the winters are more mild, and they're not they're not being killed off like they used to be. So they're coming back in such giant hordes. But that's the only one maybe I can speak to. My pest knowledge is probably fairly minimal, unfortunately. Okay, I missed the first 10 minutes, so maybe you already talked about this, but if we have prairie oak habitat on our farm area, what are some things we could consider maybe via climate change moving into the future? Are there species we should consider? If you have prairie oak habitat, that's phenomenal. Actually, my supervisor, Nicole, is very dedicated and has quite a bit of knowledge about oak prairie. Just maintaining it as an oak prairie, I think, is so critical. So making sure that it's thinned out and that those oaks really have a chance to they kind of make that funny mushroom shape. So you don't want them real tall and narrow. If they're able to bloom and kind of like really develop that full shape, that's wonderful. There's a lot of different things in the oak kind of prairie. It's a little bit, from my understanding, they're fairly tricky. Some of those forbs and like native forbs and native flowers can be a little bit tricky to establish. So in terms of species we should consider, I'd love to, I don't know, Andrew, is there a way I can reach out to her with maybe chatting with Nicole and maybe get a list together?
I'd be more than happy to send a email out to you, Nicole, and to this questioner, linking you all to.
Perfect. And I should mention also that we do perform lots of site visits. And so if you do want us, you know, if obviously if you're in Washington County, but if you are in Washington County and are interested in having myself or Nicole come out, we're more than happy to do that. And she could provide just a huge number of resources in terms of oak prairie habitat, which is so critically endangered and so cool.
Yes.
The permaculture movement contains many of the principles that you outline here. Do you embrace most of their philosophy? I don't know a ton about it. I'm not going to be super helpful on this on this question. Unfortunately, I might not have a ton of information just regarding permaculture. But I just think anything that you can do to kind of increase biodiversity, providing habitat, increasing your soil health, conserving water, all of those are just great things to be doing. They're obviously easier said than done. I'm kind of preaching, preaching but not practicing, I guess. But yeah, anything of those kind of things you're able to do are excellent. Ooh, Carolyn would also like info on establishing new oaks for habitat. Yeah, establishing new oaks are definitely, they are so slow going. I always say, I'm like, oh, well, you know, I try to include a lot of oaks in a lot of our projects, but you know, the running joke is like, I definitely won't get to see them grown up, but maybe my great-grandchildren will. Perfect. Any last questions? Well, I'll throw my info back up, just on the off chance anyone needs that. And
yeah, and if any questions come up, you know, in the next day or two after you've watched this presentation, you've had some time to think on it. I'll also include Tatiana's email. I'll CC her on that follow-up email that I send to you. Also, you'll have her direct contact. And so if there are any things about the presentation that you wanted to have some specific questions about, please feel free to reach out to her, myself, or to Alice, and we can go from there.
well, thank you so much, everyone. I appreciate it. It's fun.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for joining in this evening, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.